I want to say thank you live. Right now, I am speaking with Professor Jonathan Taplin. Jonathan Taplin is the Director Emeritus of the Annenberg Innovation School at the University of Southern California. A few years ago, he wrote an article in the Los Angeles Times. California's hardly over, but it does need to make two big changes. He wrote that in 2019. And he said, even if a progressive wins the White House, California will need to be able to take care of itself largely. California will have to chart its own future. Professor Taplin, did I get that right? And have you heard about Marjorie Taylor Greene and her call for a national divorce recently, Professor?
Yeah, I have. I think it's, on one hand, makes some sense, and on the other hand, makes no sense certainly for the red states, because the current way everything's set up is that the blue states subsidize the red states from a tax-based point of view radically. So, California puts in $1 and gets back around 72 cents to the federal government. And Mississippi puts in $1 and gets back $1.22 from the federal government. So,
right.
I mean, if there was a divorce, obviously all the red states would have to raise taxes and would be just the thing they don't want to do. And so I don't think it would work out very well for them. But on the other hand, I do believe that if Lindsey Graham wants to put in a national law that bans abortion, that the blue states need to stand up for themselves. And it's not just over abortion, it's over gun legislation, pot, all sorts of things, and so I don't think this is being thought out well, but I do think ultimately in a constitutional democracy that was set up in the 1770s to advantage the small states over the large states, that some form of federalism has got to emerge.
That's well put. Marjorie Taylor Greene on President's Day, a sitting Congress member, said that she called for a national divorce between red and blue states. Professor, it sounds like you're saying she might be a conservative. She's from a red state, well, maybe purple, maybe blue, but that the red states would really lose out. If there really was a secession movement, like full-blown separate countries, the red states would lose out because they largely take in more federal money than they receive. Is that accurate, Professor?
Yes.
Have you heard this? Now, I watched a lot of news coverage after Marjorie Taylor Greene made that statement. And I remember watching a group called Breaking Points News. They have Crystal Ball, I think her name. She's a well-known progressive. And then I was watching another show called Wonkette Analysis, which is another progressive thing. Now, these two shows spent the first 5 minutes talking about how Marjorie Taylor Greene is stupid and crazy, and this wouldn't work out, and nobody really backs it. And then a weird thing happened about 5 minutes in, these two separate shows. Hardcore liberal. After talking about how stupid an idea this was, they kind of go, yeah, but I have to admit, everyone around me that's kind of liberal is saying, well, maybe this would be a good idea for us liberals because we could get rid of these welfare queens. Have you heard any talk like that amongst fellow liberals? Is the discussion of national divorce only of interest to conservatives? Or have you ever heard liberals say, maybe, we should stop subsidizing people who don't like us? Maybe we should get that 25 cents that we're missing of our dollar back to us?
Well, I mean, I've heard some liberals say that, and I wrote a long piece in Harper's Magazine 3 years ago.
Yes, Professor.
Essentially saying that. And a lot of people from Ralph Nader on said that was a really good idea. Because look, the Senate is construed in such a way that by 2030, 30% of the people will control 70% of the seats in the Senate. 30% of the population will control 70 seats. That's just not sustainable as a way for a polity to function. And so, in other words, this anti-majoritarian rule that the Republicans are trying to pull forth is going to get worse before it gets better. And at that point, my guess is a lot of progressives will begin to think that, we don't need a divorce. We just need to have 80% of the functions, decisions made at the state level, not at the federal level. And whether those are about school choice or the way the police functions or gun legislation or women's right to choose, these things are all going to have to be made at the state level. And of course, the Supreme Court essentially said that in in eliminating Roe versus Wade, it definitely changed the nature of things, but it did say these decisions be left up to the states. But that's not good enough for the conservatives. They don't want the states. They don't want California to have the right to make its own gun laws. They want to control that from the center. And, we have to resist that.
I remember talking to some conservatives and I said, I thought you guys just contradicted yourselves. You conservatives have been saying for decades, states' rights goes back to the states. And then you finally get Roe v. Wade to return it back to the states. And what do? Mike Pence, who's the vice president, and other Republicans say, not good enough, let's ban abortion for all the states. How can you guys say you're for states' rights and then immediately you say not good enough, let's force it on you guys? You just contradicted yourself. Why should any of us believe you?
Right.
I want to...
Well, that's exactly the point.
The quote I'd like to read from your original essay, opinion piece for the Los Angeles Times in 2019. I believe this is the key statistic you're pointing out, Professor. As Norman Orstein of the American Enterprise Institute has pointed out, by 2040 or so, 70% of Americans will live in 15 states, meaning 30% of Americans will choose 70 senators, and the 30% of Americans will be older, whiter, more rural, and more male than the 70%. In other words, the Senate could well be controlled by a conservative minority for years to come, one that would be resistant to providing any aid to progressive states like California. Is that the big statistic that you're pointing on? And it sounds like you're saying because of this, liberals need to maybe entertain the idea of federalism. Maybe secession's too much. Maybe Marjorie Taylor Greene was going too much. But hey, liberals, federalism is something that works for us. Let's stop acting like it's just a conservative idea. Where am I getting that wrong, Professor?
No, that's exactly what I'm saying. And essentially, the best way to do that would be to confuse the Republicans even more, which would be to pass radical lowering of the money that flows into the federal government. In other words, lower the income taxes, everything, and raise the state income taxes. In other words, lower the federal income taxes radically, which, literally the Republicans would have nothing to say about. They'd have to accept that. And then California could raise its state income taxes. So today, if I pay 30% to the feds and 15% to the states, ideally it would be reversed. And that would have a couple of effects. One of which it would reduce the amount of money that's sloshing through the military-industrial complex, which is, as anyone can see, is raising its sights to take more and more money now because waving the red flag of China as if, we're in complete panic and, as if, we weren't spending twice as much as the Chinese per capita. Do the police function? Do the schools work? These are all local issues. They're not federal issues. And the sooner we get the federal government out of those issues, and Stephen Tellis talks about layer cake federalism, which is essentially that there's a huge overlap between like the federal Department of Education and then each state's Department of Education. They both do essentially the same thing. It's just the feds tell the states what to do. And that's not only is a huge waste of money, but it's also, why should we give the money to the federal government and then, a huge amount of it gets socked away into the federal bureaucracy and the education department, and then a small amount dribbles back to the states in terms of federal education grants to K through 12 schools. It's just a waste of money. So, there's all sorts of examples that would make it very clear that our real federalism is the way we should be going.
Let me ask you a direct question, if I may. For generations, states' rights, that's a conservative idea. We're progressives. We believe in the federal government passing laws and making progressive stuff and doing all this. How do we get liberals to start recognizing that, hey, I know we've had this philosophy for decades, but maybe we should start looking into keeping more of our money in our states so we can direct it how we want. And maybe we should embrace federalism.
When the federal government, in other words, when a Republican-controlled Congress, both not just in the House, but in the Senate as well, which is what's coming. That's what Norm Ornstein is all talking about. When a federal government, both in the House and the Senate, controlled by right-wing MAGA Republicans, starts making laws banning books, banning abortion, banning any attempt to control assault weapons at the state level, all these things, then the liberals will wake up and realize that their only hope is to hope that their states have the right to make those laws and not the federal government.
So obviously, when we saw Donald Trump elected, a lot of Californians were interested in not being part of that system. When Brett Kavanaugh...
Yeah, but secession is a waste of time. There's no point to say we don't want to be part of the United States of America. What we do want is we want to be part of the, Jefferson said it best. He said, the states should be united to everything facing outward. That is the defense, the Treasury, and the State Department. And they should be separate to everything facing inward. That is police, roads, schools, infrastructure, all of that stuff. And it's just, right now, all the money flows into Washington, and then some of it flows back to the states in the form of block grants. But that's just inefficient, and then all it does is breed these gigantic bureaucracies that anybody who's ventured through Washington, D.C. can be cognizant of.
There was a governor in California called Ronald Reagan, and when he was governor, he did a commercial running where he said the same thing you are. This is a highly inefficient system. Why are we sending money to the feds for them to pay people to look it over and then send us back some of the money we sent them in the first place? I absolutely agree. What I noticed though, is that Californians seem to be uneasy when they see the federal government maybe moving to the right. When we saw the Supreme Court go alt-right with Amy Coney Barrett, when Kavanaugh was confirmed, when the Congress looked like it might be Republicans taking over the House, when Donald Trump won the presidency, it does seem to back up your theory that liberals at least seem to become aware, hey, our rights could be threatened too, right? Like we could lose something.
Yeah, look, it's going to just take a while for people to wake up. I mean, because, my generation, the boomers, were raised on states' rights, meaning George Wallace standing in the schoolhouse door.
Right. Segregation now, segregation forever.
But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the right of California to ban assault weapons. I'm talking about the right of California women to make their own healthcare decisions, and so those are things. And look, if you look at the history of how progressive legislation has happened, where did the whole ability of gay people to marry start at the state level,
right?
And state by state by state, and eventually it got to enough states that it became a national issue, and the evangelicals fought it and took it all the way to the Supreme Court, and were shocked when the Supreme Court said, no, this is fine. States can decide, I mean, so it's just, it's just going to take time for people to understand that federalism is actually a brilliant conception, the way that the founders thought about it. I mean, look, I think the founders made a huge mistake in giving every state 2 senators, but there's nothing we can do about that. There's no constitutional method to change that, because every state has to agree, and there's no way that South Dakota is going to agree to give up its 2 senators.
Thank you. I have this debate with many people, and they go, well, if we just fix this and then we fix that, and I go, you're going to tell 35 states to give up the only political power they have now and become politically impotent?
No way.
Why would they do that?
It's not going to happen.
Yeah, why would you do that?
Happen.
Well, I'm going to give up my agency that empowers me out of the sense of goodness for the country. I'm like, who's going to do that?
It's never going to happen.
Let me ask you a few follow-up questions, if I may. Liberals need to look into federalism. We can have our rights threatened. There's also a benefit for us, and that would work. A lot of people are saying, well, there was a Utah governor who said, we don't need a national divorce. We need marriage counseling. I've also seen people come on TV and say, Marjorie Taylor Greene is crazy. There's not that much division. We basically all get along together. Is there division in America? Has there been? Has it gotten better? Or, I mean,
this is the most divided this country has ever been. And we're essentially a 50-50 country in terms of the last, 3 or 4 presidential races. I mean, and the margin is, 1%, 2% for the victor?
Right.
So, I mean, anyone who doesn't think this country is divided is just not paying any attention.
Thank you.
And anyone who thinks that somehow we're going to all sing Kumbaya and get over all this is not paying attention either. Because on one level, the old rural white minority thinks they're fighting for their survival.
Right.
They think their whole world is going away.
Right.
And the immigration and, Black Lives Matter is all the end of the world. So, I mean, they're going to fight to the end. I mean, that's why, January 6th happened.
Right.
These people thought they were fighting for their very survival.
I agree. So when someone says we don't need a national divorce, maybe states, having more federalism and splitting in the red blue, we just need marriage counseling. That doesn't necessarily ring true to you. And if not, if it does, what does marriage counseling on a national level look like?
No, it's not going to do any good. I mean, we're past, we have basic, deep differences. I mean, the governor of Texas wants everybody to be armed, open carry, no
Right.
permits, nothing, running around, and the government of California doesn't want that. And there's no, amount of marriage counseling that could get them to come to some middle ground. It's just not going to happen. They're too dug in.
That was my conclusion. And people said marriage counseling, and I go, well, didn't we have Joe Biden, and didn't he run on healing the nation and bringing a giant calming together? And I said he ran on that, and it didn't happen. If the American president can't provide marriage counseling, who else is left?
Yeah.
Okay, this has been fascinating. Do you have any questions for me? Is there anything
Nope.
you'd like to cover? Anything, last
Nope.
statements for the public?
No.
Please look up Professor Jonathan Taplin. Professor, we always appreciate you coming on. Thank you so much.
I have a new book coming out called The End of Reality, which you can pre-order on Amazon. I'd appreciate it if everyone did that. Okay.
We will promote that on the show, and I really
Okay.
appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. This is the book that the professor was talking about. Let me show you that real quick. The End of Reality, How 4 Billionaires Are Selling a Fantasy Future of the Metaverse, Mars, and Crypto by Jonathan Taplin. There it is. And again, this is an interview with Professor Jonathan Taplin, the Director Emeritus of USC Annenberg School. This is how we met, was that he brought up this statistic in 2019. It is now 2023, and things are worse than they were at that time. This was the interview that I did with him at that time. You can see. Well, thank you all for coming out. We hope you found this informative. We're trying to talk to people that are educated in this space so that you can hear from experts about the conversation of national divorce and what it actually means, not just the mainstream media. As you saw there, and we have been covering, the mainstream media is acting like, oh, there's no division and everything's fine. And I've told you many people going, that's ridiculous. So I've just proven to you where we have experts in the field saying there is division, and you have the mainstream media saying, no, there's not. That should tell you everything. Okay, we'll see you again in the future, and thank you for coming out.